Tonight, the state's Chamber of Commerce is sounding the alarm, saying Minnesota's economy is falling behind other states.
Picture this. 10.9 million people who aren't supposed to be working in America just paid $96.7 billion in taxes last year. They put $25.7 billion into Social Security, money they'll never see. Another $6.4 billion went to Medicare, which they're legally banned from using. And here's the part that's going to blow your mind.
The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce is warning about changes to the state economy, and it is not good.
Minnesota's economy is not growing very fast. And that's where we see some concerns around the trend line.
In 40 out of 50 states, these workers pay higher tax rates than the top 1% of earners. Let me say that again. Undocumented immigrants pay more in taxes than billionaires in 40 states. In Minnesota alone, 95,000 undocumented residents generate $222 million in annual tax revenue.
We should not be surprised by this dramatic increase because this program creates an incentive for illegal immigrants to come here to Minnesota.
New York? Try 640,000 undocumented immigrants responsible for $40 billion in economic output. That's 3% of the entire state's economy. So here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. What happens when you remove the invisible workforce actually holding the economy together? Stick around because the data on this is absolutely wild. The pattern America keeps repeating. A brief background. Before we dive into Minnesota and New York, we need to talk about history, because America has done this before, multiple times, and every time the economic consequences were the opposite of what politicians promised. Take 1882 as a case study. The Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese laborers who made up 90% of the workforce building America's transcontinental railroads. The justification? American workers complained about wage competition. Sound familiar? Railroad companies had to restructure, so projects got delayed and costs skyrocketed. Politicians promised American workers would fill those jobs and wages would rise. Spoiler alert, that's not what happened. Fast forward to 1924. Congress passes the National Origins Act, slashing immigration to 165,000 per year. Policymakers had clear goals: reduce low-skilled workers, boost productivity, raise wages. A Princeton University study found that yes, foreign-born workers were replaced by higher-skilled Americans. But labor markets didn't function as predicted. Wages didn't surge, and restrictions created unintended consequences that screwed regional economies for decades. Then, 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act abolishes discriminatory quotas. Immigration surges from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, not Europe as expected. People follow economic opportunity whether there's a law against it or not. That brings us to today, where the same debates are happening. But this time, the data is so overwhelming that ignoring it requires willful blindness. The numbers that don't lie. Let me hit you with facts that'll make you question everything you've heard. Undocumented immigrants make up 5% of the U.S. workforce. But look where they're working. 1 in 7 construction workers, 1 in 8 agriculture workers, 1 in 14 hospital workers. Nearly 31 million immigrants worked in the U.S. in 2024, accounting for 19.2% of the civilian workforce. But here's what nobody's talking about. Stanford research found that despite making up only 16% of inventors, immigrants are responsible for 30% of all U.S. innovation since 1976. In 2024, 46% of Fortune 500 companies were founded by immigrants or their children. We're talking about the people who built Apple, Amazon, and DoorDash. Minnesota, where the economy runs on invisible labor. Minnesota's got 95,000 undocumented immigrants generating $222 million in state and local taxes in 2022. That number would jump to $294 million with work authorization, an additional $72 million Minnesota is leaving on the table. Let me introduce you to Hasib Azam, co-owner of New York Gyro in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Usually at lunchtime, his place is packed with customers craving halal pita sandwiches. But recently, very slow, very slow, especially for the last couple weeks, Azam told reporters. With immigration enforcement activity, people are scared. His business has tanked. Abdi Daisene, a Somali-American business owner, has been talking to businesses across the state. They already see the impact. Less people showing up. But here's where it gets really interesting. Look at which industries in Minnesota depend on this workforce. Food processing shows the highest sector dependency at 28%. That means more than 1 in 4 workers in Minnesota's meatpacking and food manufacturing industries are undocumented. Construction, 13.9%. Manufacturing, transportation, service industries, they all depend significantly on immigrant labor. A study by HACER, that's Hispanic Advocacy and Community Empowerment Through Research, looked at southern Minnesota specifically, and what they found was shocking. Experts were unanimous. Vital industries would not be able to continue functioning without this workforce. And here's the controversial part that employers admitted on the record. They would probably be unwilling to hire U.S. citizens for these jobs because of the higher costs of retirement funds and healthcare benefits. Let that sink in for a second. It's not that American workers won't do these jobs. It's that employers have built their entire business models around paying lower wages and benefits to undocumented workers. The Minnesota Chamber of Commerce reported in February 2025 that the state's foreign-born population added over 100,000 workers to the labor force between 2010 and 2023. And Minnesota needs every single one of them because the state's economy is struggling. It ranks 41st in GDP growth, 40th in labor force growth, and 37th in job growth. Without immigration, these numbers would be catastrophic. But wait, here's the part showing how dependent Minnesota has become. 51 of 87 counties had more deaths than births from 2020 to 2023. These counties depend entirely on migration to sustain economies. Mower and Kandiyohi counties saw small gains, but without immigration, populations would have declined by 506 and 431 people. Lose 500 people in small communities and schools close, businesses shut down, and towns die. 72% of Minnesota's undocumented population has lived there over 10 years. 58% live in mixed-status families. These aren't temporary workers hopping the border. These are people who've built lives, raised families, and become structurally embedded in Minnesota's economy. If Minnesota's numbers surprised you, wait until you see New York. New York, the status and background. New York's got 640,000 to 676,000 undocumented immigrants who paid $3.1 billion in state and local taxes in 2022. With work authorization, that jumps to $4.0 billion, almost $900 million in additional revenue. The Fiscal Policy Institute is blunt. Unauthorized immigrants are responsible for $40 billion. That is 3% of New York's total economic output. Here's the breakdown. Construction, 29,500 workers. Maids and housekeeping, 20,900 workers. Cooks, 16,800 workers. Home health care aides, 16,800 workers. Janitors, 13,600 workers. What happens if you remove 16,800 home health care aides? Who takes care of the elderly? Remove 29,500 construction workers. Who builds the buildings? 70% of undocumented workers in New York work in essential industries. In healthcare, they're 1/3 of sector workers, 2/3 of home healthcare workers, 24% of food service workers. Let me tell you about Ismael, a farm worker in New York. He works 60 to 72 hours weekly outdoors in sub-zero winters and scorching summers. He lives with 4 co-workers in employer housing. If we get sick, the entire farm will get sick, he said. His employer knows. If workers get sick, the farm can't operate. If the farm stops, workers lose jobs. It's symbiotic. In New York City, immigrants make up 36% of the population and 43% of the workforce. 1.8 million foreign-born workers contributing $383 billion. Without them, the city's workforce would be shrinking. NYC lost 100,000 workers since February 2020. Immigration is the only thing preventing complete collapse. Former Mayor Michael Bloomberg said it. Although they broke the law, our city's economy would be a shell of itself had they not, and it would collapse if they were deported. 55% of New York's undocumented population has lived in the U.S. for 10 years or more. These are embedded community members. What happens when you remove the foundation? The Peterson Institute estimated deporting 1.3 to 8.3 million undocumented immigrants would reduce U.S. GDP by 7% by 2028. That's worse than the 2008 financial crisis. Another analysis projected removing undocumented workers would shrink the economy by $1.1 to $1.7 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office found immigration surges boost the economy by $7 trillion over the next decade. The National Foundation for American Policy calculated current enforcement policies could cut annual economic growth by 1/3 by 2035. Immigrants create demand for goods produced by U.S.-born workers and work alongside them to increase productivity, said Mark Rigetz. Remove the workers, lose the consumers. Demand crashes, Americans lose jobs. It's a spiral. The promises that don't match reality. The Trump administration returned in 2025, suspending refugee resettlement, rolling back protections, raising visa fees, ramping up deportations. Foreign-born workers declined by over 1 million between January and August 2025. The argument, limiting immigration raises wages and creates opportunities for Americans. There is no shortage of American minds and hands. White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson stated, "The problem? Early data contradicts this completely. Job growth in industries reliant on undocumented labor, hotels, restaurants, construction, healthcare, has been weaker than the rest of the private sector. Not stronger, weaker." The Labor Department warned in October 2025 that immigration policies risk labor shortages, especially in agriculture where 68% of farm laborers are foreign-born. Minnesota's food processing faces disruption with 28% dependency. You can't replace 28% of an industry overnight. New York's 640,000 undocumented workers generate 3% of state output. Economists warn that hole can't be quickly filled. When America restricted immigration in 1882 and 1924, consequences didn't match promises. Wages didn't automatically rise. Industries struggled and economies got hammered. The difference in 2025 is scale. America's economy is more integrated with immigrant labor than ever. We're talking $96.7 billion in annual taxes, structural dependency in critical industries, and an aging workforce not being replaced by native-born workers. Minnesota has 51 counties where deaths exceed births. New York City loses workers yearly. Immigration has been masking structural economic challenges. Whether policies account for economic realities will determine the future of states like Minnesota and New York, and millions of Americans whose jobs depend on the invisible workforce. That's the uncomfortable truth. The American economy is structurally dependent on undocumented labor. Whether that should exist is political. That it does exist is economic fact. The question isn't whether undocumented immigrants contribute anymore. Data settles that. The question is what happens when you remove the foundation holding everything up. Based on history, current data, and what's happening in Minnesota and New York, the answer doesn't look good. So that's where we stand. Whatever happens next, the economic consequences will be massive. Hit that subscribe button because this story is far from over. I'll see you in the next video.